Okay, we'd like to begin panel number 2, a regional look at Iraq from 4 scholars, which I think will provide some rich material that is perhaps a little more inaccessible in the public media, yet probably one of the most important areas for discussion and understanding this problem that we're looking at today. Our first panelist will be Dr. Masoud Kazemzadeh, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Utah Valley State College. We'd also like to express our appreciation to Boyd Bauer of the Butler Center for International Understanding at UVSC, who was instrumental also in supporting and suggesting Dr. Kazemzadeh. He received his BS in International Relations from the University of Minnesota and an MA and PhD in Political Science from the University of Southern California. He was a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard. He is the recipient of the Western Political Science Association's Best Dissertation on Political Science Award for 1996. His articles have been published in PS Political Science and Politics, Middle East Policy, and Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. His second book came out in September, Islamic Fundamentalism, Feminism, and Gender Inequality in Iran under Khomeini, from the University Press of America in Lanham. He will be addressing the issue of Iran and an Iranian perspective of its neighbor, Iraq. Our second panelist, Dr. David Montgomery, is a professor of history emeritus at Brigham Young University. Professor Montgomery came here in 1970 and has taught world history, Near Eastern history, and some aspects of Russian history for the department. He was trained in the Asian part of the former Soviet Union and received a PhD from Indiana University. He spent a Fulbright year in Turkey as well as 5 months in Soviet Uzbekistan, with the distinction of being the first American to have lived there, and with subsequent periods of residence in the area. He works with Russian, Turkish, and Uzbek languages and is currently engaged in research on aviation and military history. Our third panel is Dr. Abdul, who is currently visiting professor of sociology at BYU. He received his BS degree from Boston University and an MA and PhD from BYU. Currently, he is a visiting professor in the Department of Sociology, and before that, he taught at Hiram College in Hiram, Ohio. Professor Gollub was a senior government employee in Sudan and worked as a journalist and diplomat in Lebanon and in England. And finally, Major Brent Talbot of the United States Air Force Academy, who serves as an assistant professor of political science in Colorado Springs. He holds a bachelor and master's degree in international relations from Brigham Young University and has completed his PhD studies in international and comparative politics at the University of Denver. His specialties include Middle East politics and security studies. Major Talbot has traveled throughout the Middle East, including Israel, Turkey, Syria, Kuwait, and Jordan. He is married to Laura Phillips, who's also a BYU graduate and has 5 children. Now, I didn't mention all the working titles because this is, again, kind of a work in process, so we will turn the time over to Professor Kazemzadeh and we will proceed through, and hopefully we do have an hour and 40 minutes blocked out, so we'll have time for all of their comments as well as questions from the audience.
Thank you, Kurt. The subject of my talk is the perspectives and views of Iranian political groups on American President Bush's policy of regime change in Iraq. There are 5 major groupings in Iran. Iranian society is much more complex than American. The reason is Iran is moving from a pre-modern, pre-capitalist, traditional, not as developed society towards a more modern, democratic capitalist. Therefore, the society is much more complex with various social classes and ideologies. These 5 major groupings. Within each grouping, there are several parties and tendencies and factions. On the x-axis, I use on the far right the pre-capitalist, pre-modern groups. Center, I put parties and groups that support a capitalist system. On the right, and then liberal, they are all under capital. Communists are those groups that advocate the state owning and controlling all the major means of production. On the y-axis, I put under democratic those groups that advocate civil liberties, free elections. They protect the groups that they disagree with, the civil liberties of groups with whom they disagree. On the authoritarian side, I put those groups that would like to have a one-party dictatorship, do not respect the civil liberties of the groups with whom they disagree. The five groups are, the fundamentalists would be on the far right, pre-capitalist, pre-modern area, very authoritarian. There are several factions among fundamentalists. The two largest are the hardliners under the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei right here, very, very pre-modern, very authoritarian. And fundamentalists are not one person, one group, it's an oligarchy. Right now, the leadership of the reformist fundamentalists is held by a mid-ranking cleric, Khatami, who is the president. So this is the first grouping who have been in power since 1979 revolution. The second group are Iranian monarchists. They are for capitalism, very conservative, very, very authoritarian. The last dynasty, the Pahlavi dynasty, since 1921, has been very subservient to Western powers. First Britain and since 1953, the United States. The third major grouping in Iranian politics are the pro-democracy groups. The largest, the oldest is Iran National Front, which is liberal democratic / social democratic, very, very for civil liberties. It's a secular political party, which means that it believes in the separation of religion and state, Islam, mosque and state, also religion and politics. They believe that Islam should be a religion, a private matter for the individual. They oppose transforming Islam into a political ideology. Around here are the two groups, LMI, Liberation Movement of Iran, and RNA, Religious Nationalist Alliance. They combine democracy and Islam, a very liberal, if you will, interpretation and reading of Islam. They are Iran's equivalent to Christian democratic parties of Europe and Latin America. The fourth major group is PMOI, which stands for People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran. In the U.S. media, newspapers refer to them with the acronyms MKO, Mujahideen Khalq Organization. The organization was created in 1965. It's a guerrilla group. It believes in armed struggle. It fought against the Shah's regime. They assassinated 2 or 3 Americans in the early 70s. Although from 80 to 84 they denied that in order to get support from the United States government in their struggle against the fundamentalist regime. In the 80s, they were the most potent armed group against the fundamentalist government. They have assassinated several hundred top leaders of the fundamentalist regime. They are, since 1985, based in Iraq. They have 7 major bases, military bases in Iraq, and 2 or 3 smaller ones in Baghdad. Saddam has provided them with tanks, a helicopter gunship. There are at least 4,000 armed men and women in the PMOI. They have been trying since 1984 to get support from the U.S. government. The State Department has classified them as a terrorist organization and has not provided them with any assistance. Finally, there are Iranian communist groups. There are about 20 communist groups. 1 or 2 I would classify as a little bit larger than small. Others are very, very small. In the late 70s, early 80s, they were much more powerful. They did have impact on Iranian politics. In the past 10 years, they have become very, very marginalized for many reasons. One of them is they are divided into 20 different groups. Most of them are Stalinists. All of them have been Stalinists. In the past 5-6 years, a few of them have moved away from extreme left and extreme authoritarianism. I just put one of them, which is absolutely the worst one, the most extreme, the most authoritarian. These are the 5 major groupings. Let's begin with the views of the 2 major factions among fundamentalists. This is the organizational chart. No. think one thing UBSC has better than BYU is our overhead projectors, by the way. Okay, well, I'll explain it. This is the organizational chart of the Iranian fundamental system I made for my students. This thing is called Assembly of Experts. There are 85 members. The median age of the members are 75 years old. They are all fundamentalist Shiite clerics. Fundamentalist clerics account for about 10% of all the Shia clerics. The other 90% are classified as Orthodox or traditional. Traditional Shiites and Shia clerics believe for what is Shiism called Intizar, waiting for the 12th Shiite Imam, Shia Islam's Messiah, to arrive. So they don't get involved in politics. Under Khomeini's innovation, the Shiite clerics, who are now called fundamentalists, believe in getting into power and directly ruling society. They select what is called the supreme leader. In 89, a Mizrahi cleric, Ali Khamenei, was appointed by the Assembly of Experts to be supreme leader. The supreme leader has enormous amount of power. That's it. No election, no nothing. He has power. He appoints everything from Bunyads, huge economic conglomerates. There are dozens of them. The largest one has assets over $10 billion. All the commanders of the armed forces, including Pasdaran, Basij, the fundamentalist armed paramilitary groups, whose major job is to defend the fundamentalist regime and harass the opposition, democratic and non-democratic opposition. The supreme leader appoints the head of the judiciary, which is very, very powerful in this system. This thing is called Council of Guardians. There are 12 members. 6 members of the Guardian Council are directly appointed by the supreme leader. The other 6 members are nominated by the head of the judiciary and then confirmed by the parliament. This is the parliament. These 12 people have enormous political power in the fundamentalist system. They pre-select who can be the president. They nominate or they pre-select, for example, in 97, 4 people. And then the people could vote for those 4. The same thing for the parliament. It has 290 members. Now, they increased the number a few years ago. The Guardian Council, or the Council of Guardians, for each constituency pre-selects 2 or 3 members of the fundamentalist elite, and then those 2 or 3 compete for the vote. Whichever gets the most votes gets elected. And in the last election, one young man they allowed to run. They assumed he's a fundamentalist. He became known he's not a fundamentalist. And he got elected, and immediately they disqualified him. They kicked him out of the parliament. So these 12 members have enormous power. In May 97, one of the 4 was a mid-ranking cleric, a member of the fundamentalist elite who had been in the cabinet for since 1981. Khatami. In the West, he's called a reformist, and he was one of the members of the reformist wing. He got 5 years ago, in May 97, 68% of the vote. He got re-elected by 72% of the vote last year. He believes in reducing tension and détente with the West. His nickname in Iran is Ayatollah Gorbachev, which has made the hardliners freak out and even resist his attempted reform. The hardliners control everything except the presidency since May 97 and the parliament since last year. So there's a competition among the 2 major wings, major factions of the fundamentalist elite. Now, what do they believe? What's their perspective on the U.S. war on Iraq? Short answer is they're very, very confused. They don't have one coherent answer. And it has been since at least January 29, President Bush's State of the Union address, where he talked about regime change and axis of evil, which he put Saddam's regime, the fundamentalist regime in Iran, and the communist regime in North Korea. So, the hardliners, one of the senior advisors to the supreme leader, who makes almost all the decisions of war and peace, all those decisions are within the prerogatives of the supreme leader. He said that his name is Sharif Madari. He was a former torturer at the Evin prison for political prisoners. He, in an interview with a British journalist, said that if Iran shoot down American fighters, jet fighters, in the war between U.S. and Saddam Hussein. The reason is both factions, hardliners and reformers alike, believe that President Bush's doctrine is regime change in Iran as well. So first, the U.S. is going to go overthrow Saddam, install a pro-U.S. government. Then the U.S. is going to go and invade Iran, overthrow the fundamentalists. And so fundamentalists are very, very concerned. So the question is not that whether or not they hate Saddam, they obviously do intensely. One major concern in Iran for all groups, fundamentalists and non-fundamentalists alike, is that if, say, 4 or 5 years from now, Saddam Hussein was able to have nuclear weapons, what would he do with it? A serious concern is he would threaten Iranian government with dropping nuclear bombs on Tehran, which has 12 million people, unless Iranian government gives Saddam the oil-rich province of Khuzestan, which is on the border with Iraq, and Saddam was claiming that during the 8-year war. So, they hate Saddam Hussein, but their major concern is to remain in power. They're very, very concerned that the U.S. President Bush's concern is to overthrow the fundamentalists if he succeeds in overthrowing Saddam Hussein. Hardliners believe that the most vulnerable time for the U.S. is during the war with Iraq. Therefore, if they could prevent the United States from overthrowing Saddam, then they would be able to remain in power. The U.S. would not be able to go to the next stage, a war with a fundamentalist regime. Reformists believe that American military power is so awesome they would be able to overthrow Saddam very quickly and install a pro-American government, very much like Karzai government in Afghanistan. And they believe that American military is so strong it could defeat a fundamentalist regime in Iran and have a regime change in Iran. So basically, the reformists advocate crying uncle. They have said that they would like to have dialogue and negotiations with the U.S., and U.S. has pretty much 3 or 4 serious concerns about Iran, the fundamentalist regime in Iran. One is Iranian support, fundamentalist government support for terrorist organizations such as Lebanese Hezbollah, which killed 241 U.S. Marines in Beirut, blew up American embassy, French embassy. So the U.S. government would like Iranian fundamentalist government to stop giving money to Lebanese Hezbollah. To PIJ, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, another group, the so-called Saudi Hezbollah or Hijaz Hezbollah in Saudi Arabia, which in '96 blew up the Al-Khobar towers, killed 19 U.S. Air Force personnel. Iranian government supports those groups. One of the concerns of the United States is that fundamentalist regime in Iran should stop supporting terrorist organizations around the world. Secondly, the United States are concerned about the behavior of the fundamentalist regime in Iran is Iranian support for radical Palestinian groups that oppose the peace process between Israelis and Palestinians, such as Hamas and PIJ, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Thirdly, U.S. is very concerned about WMD in Iran, weapons of mass destruction, particularly the nuclear program. Fourthly, U.S. government sometimes not as serious as the first 3 is about the human rights violations in Iran, which is perhaps, with the exception of Saddam, the worst violations of human rights in the world. So, reformist fundamentalists could easily give in on the first 3 and perhaps even reduce repression on human rights violations under number 4. The problem is the hardliners oppose that. They believe that by doing so they have given up on revolutionary zeal, the exporting fundamentalist revolution, and they really do fear reducing repression would cascade out of control as it did in USSR, Eastern Europe, and they would be overthrown. And they have done so much repression of the Iranian people, they do fear that they would be killed by the people if they reduce repression. So those are the views of the government. Getting back to the second major group, the monarchists. The monarchists have been subservient to Western powers, UK and US. They would support strongly America military going to invading Iraq or replacing Saddam Hussein. They also support the United States invading Iran, overthrowing the fundamentalists, and putting them in power. And they are willing to have a right-wing dictatorial system in Iran with the help of American Marines, helping them consolidate power. That's quite clear. The third major group are the pro-democracy organizations and powers. And in the past 7 days in Tehran, they have been fighting university students and faculty professors against a ruling the Harline court had against a history professor. 3 years ago, the pro-democracy students had a 5-day uprising. So they are quite strong in Iran and becoming increasingly more powerful. 2.5 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, the Iran National Front U.S. branch issued a proclamation and policy statement. And 2.5 weeks ago, one of the 5 members of the Executive Committee of Iran National Front in Tehran had a speech in which he issued this, more or less the same kind of harsh warning. The warning was to the fundamentalist ruling elites, particularly the hardliners. They warned the regime not to side with Saddam Hussein, not to shoot at American jet fighters. The argument as the INF proclamation 2 weeks ago, the U.S. branch was, that they said it's against Iran's national interest to get involved with the war with the United States. They advocate Iran to remain neutral, to be neutral in the war between the United States and Iraq. U.S. military is so strong, there would be large number of Iranian casualties. So they're saying it just doesn't make sense for Iran to get involved. It's against Iranian national interest. So they advocate Iran remaining neutral in the U.S. war against Saddam Hussein, and they harshly criticize and warn the hardliners and the fundamentalist elites. They're saying that the best way to prevent the United States in military invasion of Iran is to hold free elections where all Iranians could participate, and or a free referendum on the fundamentalist rule. Do people want Islamic rule, or would they like democracy? And they are confident that the overwhelming majority of Iranian people would choose democracy over the fundamentalist dictatorship. So that's their position. There are some nuances here and there. LMI and RNA have not as strongly, harshly criticized the ruling regime. They're much worried about repression. 90 of their members last year were arrested on the false trumped-up charges of spying for the United States. So this group basically is remaining neutral, neither supporting nor going to war against the United States in President Bush's forthcoming war or possible war in Iraq, and they're asking the fundamentals to hold free elections. The PMOI, they are strongly against United States invasion of Iraq for obvious reasons. They are being supported by Saddam Hussein, and if the U.S. invaded Iraq, Saddam is overthrown, the Iraqis who are anti-Saddam Hussein would come to power. They're going to go and attack PMOI or MKO, as Americans call them. And there's at least 4,000 fighters over there, and they would probably be killed or arrested by the anti-Saddam Iraqis. There had been military clashes between PUK, Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, and PMOI. There has been military clashes between PMOI and an Iranian funded group called Askiri, Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution of Iraq, in the past 10-15 years. So PMOI is completely against American invasion of Iraq. The communist groups in Iran, like communist groups and leftist groups in Europe, Latin America, and the U.S., are strongly against American invasion of Iraq. However, I'm quite surprised they have not been as strong, as harsh, as vociferous in opposing American military intervention in Iraq. One of the very few groups in Iraq that opposes American military intervention, other than Saddam's regime, of course, is the Iraqi Communist Party and the Iraqi Ba'athist Party, the faction that is allied with Syria. But again, to my surprise, I expected Iranian communists to be much more strongly against American military intervention. They don't support it, but they have been much more quiet. So these are the views of the various Iranian groups on the U.S. war on Iraq and regime change in Iraq.
I guess I'm next. Am I next, Corey? Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Symbolic, he passes out bottles of water before my talk. I believe the way things are developing in the Near East, and always have been, water has been the most important liquid in the Near East. Certainly, its availability for agriculture, both pastoral and farming, has been important. And in fact, it was the water of the riverine river valleys, the mountain oases, which did permit the development of agriculture in the Near East some 10,000 years ago, to develop into flourishing civilized societies, the first of which that we know about, of course, was in the area we now call Iraq. My goal today is to briefly give a broad, long-term perspective on what we could call the geopolitical economic situation of Iraq and its adjacent areas, and what the long-term trend may mean for or influence on the short-term future. By long-term, I could go back to 10,000 some years. I won't go back to when Adam was a boy, but nevertheless, the area has a rich, varied, and very long history. Significantly, in the last 2,000 years, a major role for that area we call Iraq, or traditional Mesopotamia, has been as a middleman economic zone in the century before Christ. A transcontinental trading system developed between the Roman Empire of the Mediterranean and China at the other end of Asia. Goods from the east and the west traversed, with Iraq as a nexus, a connection point to a great extent. And the middleman role of Iraq, its prosperous agriculture, its talented manufacturers, caused it to be a economically bustling area approximately until the 16th century AD, some 300-400 years ago. At this time, Iraq and a larger part of Southwest Asia went into a type of economic and therefore political, military, cultural decline. This was due to the fact, or largely influenced by the fact, that the Europeans, the Western Europeans, had mastered high seas oceanic navigation and could sail from the Atlantic around Africa through the Indian Ocean to the ports of the Persian Gulf, to the ports of India, and take the riches of these areas away in European shipping, causing a great decline for the Central Asian caravan trade and the traditional middleman trade which was found in Southwest Asia, of Atlantic Europe. with its trading empires, caused a decline of much of West Asia. It was not until the early 20th century that a revival came for the area of Southwest Asia, particularly in the area of Iraq and the Persian Gulf, in that oil was suspected, detected, and extracted. In the decades, this happened in the decade before World War I and with increasing pace after World War I. A new source of wealth, historically unprecedented, came to the region of the Persian Gulf and Iraq. And this new source of wealth, on which the industrializing world was becoming increasingly dependent, the source of wealth was in an area of difficult access by Western military forces. I'm sure the history of the Near East would be quite different if the oil were found in coastal Syria or in the delta of Egypt, but it is not. And so this unique, necessary, and hard to access by the West product caused a revival and a redistribution of wealth in the course of the 20th century, allowing the modernization of the Arab Peninsular states, the growth of the country of Iraq, the modernization of Iran. By the end of the 20th century, we have a Western world even more dependent on oil from this region, but confronted with political entities which are no longer tribal forces on camels and horses with swords and muskets, but equipped with jet fighters and machine guns and tanks, which, by the way, themselves are weapons of mass destruction if you happen to be on the scene. So that definition is kind of hard to say when does one, how large is the mass you're going to disrupt. So. And the cost of controlling access to the oil of the Persian Gulf region has greatly risen. A second factor must be considered, and that is a new source of petroleum products, both oil and natural gas, has been increasingly developed during the last 2 decades in the area of the Caspian Sea, which has the Caucasus region in the west and Turkestan, the former Soviet Muslim republics, on the east. These new sources of petroleum products are a great supplement to and competitor with the oil of the Persian Gulf region, whereas Iraqi oil and Arab oil and Iranian oil, to a great extent, have a significant, let's say Arabian oil mainly, has a degree of Western financial entanglement. Iraqi and Arabian oil has Western financial entanglements, investments. But Iraqi and Iranian oil are largely national oil companies. The West had significantly invested in the oil of the Caspian and Turkestan region. And the accessing that oil and gas and the distribution and marketing of that is very important. The question comes, how are we going to bring more sources of oil online, and who is going to control them? Iran and Iraq want more national control, might say there's more international participation in the oil of the Caspian and the Arab countries. And then we add one other factor, the role of Russia. Russia, with the breakup of its former brief-lived Soviet empire, is in a position where it has the same geographical extent as it had 300 years ago in the time of Peter the Great. It has lost much of its access to the Baltic Sea as a result of the independence of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. It has lost much of its access to the Black Sea with the rise of an independent Ukraine, and its former Muslim colonies acquired in the 19th century in both the Caucasus and Turkestan have also been lost. It is important for Russia to have a strategic outlet for its own products and access to strategic products. The Central and Western Europe are strong. China in the Far East is strong. Historically, when Russia has been blocked in Europe, it has looked to the south. In the time of Peter the Great, Russian expeditionary forces probed through the Caucasus Mountain, probed through the Trans-Caspian area to the borders of Iran, seeking access to the Persian Gulf and Indian Ocean. These areas now are no longer sources of exotic trade goods, but valuable petroleum. Russia has a considerable investment in Iraq. Iraq is some $30 billion in debt to Russia for industrial goods and mainly for military technology. It is in the interest of Russia, with its changed strategic economic situation, to maintain a type of economically viable Iraq, to pay that debt, and also to facilitate Russian access to the wealth of the South, to counterbalance the growing competition for Iran from the south, China from the east, Turkey from the west, in the developing riches of Central Asia. And Iraq, with its in its location across the Caucasus, its location at the head of the Persian Gulf, would seem to be a type of strategic partner in the long run for Russia. And thus, we must consider Russia's views on Iraq. What type of regime change? In particular, what type of economic arrangements any regime would have to facilitate the maintenance of Russian strength and prestige in the areas of Eastern Europe.
Thank you very much, Corey, for inviting me. And I will talk about the Arab media and how it has been covering the Iraqi issue. Boyd Barrett described news agencies reflecting different points on a continuum which itself is made up of different dimensions. This should equal to the Arab media. Technologies of broadcasting satellite and the computer-mediated communication systems have provided a valued component for the local and regional networks in the area. In addition, the technologies have been at the very heart of the strategies of negotiating and organizing relations between the region and Arabs in the diaspora, the region's inter-communication processes, and to a certain extent the region's intra-communication with the rest of the world. In this context of social, political, and communication changes, new actors and media outlets have emerged in the field, providing platforms for resistance, negotiation, and integration. With the advent of these new forms and platforms of seeing, listening, and thinking about the media and about local and international relations, the processes for production. However, before surveying the different approaches of the media and how they have been covering the current Iraqi issue, certain brief mapping of this media is necessary. First, by far the most attention that has been paid recently by public and private actors in and outside the region is to direct broadcast TV, much more than radio or even print journalism. This is partly because the introduction of Arabsat, which is a satellite connected on the one hand, and its connection to the other global satellite communication systems on the other, has enhanced the immediacy and reach of the Arab TV as a global medium. Now, the Qatari TV network, Al Jazeera, claims to have a daily audience of more than 10 million viewers worldwide. Other Arab networks that include ART, which is Arab Radio and TV, the Egyptian Nile network and Al Masriya, the Lebanese LBC, Dubai, MBC, which is stationed in London, Al Manar, and other stations compete vigorously to present their local and international audience entertainment and news services. Arab and non-Arab governments, politicians, and communicators, struck by the huge audience of Al Jazeera, in particular, tried either to muzzle it or to manipulate it for their own goals. It is worth mentioning that Osama bin Laden has framed his message to fit this particular medium and its global reach. During the current Iraqi crisis, Al Jazeera reached out for international and Arab officials, scholars, and journalists alike to debate the issue. Second, another important new medium is the Internet. In many ways, the Internet has provided an alternative medium for the ultra-radical groups of Al-Qaeda and its sympathizers to spread their news and propaganda reproduced in Arabic, English, and other languages. It might look curious that some of these websites operated by these groups were removed from the servers hosting them, only to appear again after a short time in other servers. Now, sites like Jihad Online have been frequently cited by journalists, researchers, and law enforcement agencies as a source of information about these terrorist groups and their activities. Third, the print media or the old media. Here, one can identify and differentiate between newspapers published in the Arabic, English, and French languages in the Arab world according to ownership. In this context, the dominant model in some Arab countries is the state-owned type of papers, as in Iraq and Syria. In countries like Lebanon, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, Kuwait, and to some extent Tunisia, there are primary private-owned papers with varying degrees of freedom to gather, publish, and comment on the news. In other countries like Egypt, there is a mixture of the two models, while in major Western capitals, several Arab newspapers are published and distributed worldwide. Several Western journalists and writers like Edward Said, Robert Fisk, Thomas Friedman, and Roger Owen, to mention a few, contribute weekly and occasional opinion columns to major newspapers like Al-Ahram in Egypt and the Sharq al-Awsat in London and Al-Hayat in London. The information superhighway provided sites for most Arab newspapers and an opportunity and a global audience. So the media construction of the Iraqi crisis, which dominated the debate in the Middle East and the Islamic world as well, is firmly linked to the above-mentioned developments as well as to other sorts of new and old ties in the Arab world. 6 factors held simultaneously might have given the ongoing media debate about Iraq its identity and its characteristics. Number 1, the collective Arab position to the conflict is completely different now from that of the 1990 consolidated stance and sentiment when Iraq invaded Kuwait and acquired a territory of a sovereign state by force. Today, President Bush's plan of regime change in Iraq has been met with alarm and a very high degree of apprehension. The Saudi political analyst and the deputy editor of Arab News, Jamal Ahmed Khashoggi, reflected the Saudi fear, which is shared by most Arab rulers when he wrote, "Besides the adverse effect that direct U.S. intervention in Iraq would have on regional governments, Saudi Arabia seems concerned at the prospects of the operation getting out of hand. Baghdad might resort to weapons of mass destruction against American troops or against Israel, for example. The U.S. or Israel would then respond with overwhelming force. Such a scenario would lead to catastrophic upheavals in the region." Kamal maintained that U.S. intervention might also trigger Iraq's fragmentation. Civil war may break out. There might be an exodus of people from neighboring countries, causing these countries to intervene. In short, there is nothing to guarantee the process of regime change would be clean and orderly. End quote. Such views were repeated over and over within all Arab media in the last period. 2, Arab media have never stopped talking about the American plan to redraw the political map of the Middle East. The Egyptian Al-Akhbar wrote Monday, November 11th, quote, "The repercussions of this possible war for the region are numerous. The new American empire aims to redraw the map of the region for a purely American perspective, which has no consideration for the interests of the region's countries, except for the interests of Israel, which exploits everything for its existence." End quote. The London-based Al-Quds Al-Arabi warned, "A year from now, the U.S. will have completed its plan in the region and occupied Iraq or even other Arab countries. Then it will tell the Egyptian mediators or its Palestinian ally, 'Thank you, God will help you.'" Al-Arab Al-Alamiyah another London-based paper, wrote, quote, "You have to be brothers and show solidarity in defeating the Zionist plans against Iraq today and Syria, Iran, Saudi Arabia tomorrow." End of quote. 3. On the other hand, the media in the neighboring Middle Eastern countries voiced considerable alarm that an attack on Iraq is just a part of President Bush's wider regional agenda. In Iran, where fear has been expressed about the anti-Iran conspiracy, the Jamhuri Islami paper warned that U.S. is inciting sedition now more than at any other time in a bid to topple the Islamic regime in Iran. 4. One of the issues that has been debated extensively in the Arab media is that the issue of Iraq has been framed within the American media and official American discourse as if Iraq is but one man, Saddam Hussein. During the current American campaign in Iraq, wrote Edward Said in Al-Ahram, "It is the people of Iraq, the vast majority of whom have paid a terrible price in poverty, malnutrition, and illness as a result of 10 years of sanctions, who have dropped out of sight. That," he argues, Iraq Iraq with 5,000 years or 1,005 years old history, Iraq is mainly now thought of as either a threat to its neighbors, which in its currently weakened and besieged condition is rank nonsense, or a threat to the freedom and security of the United States, which is more nonsense. End of quote. He concluded, the bleeding wound of Iraq suffering has, like the Palestinian torment, been a source of continuing sorrow for Arabs and Muslims alike. End of quote. 5. And then there was oil. The Lebanese Daily Al-Nahar wrote that, quote, "The U.S. bazaar on the Iraq has opened. The smell of oil coming more from the coalition seeking to overthrow Saddam Hussein is stronger than that from the oil fields." And finally, after November 8th Security Council resolution, the Kuwaiti paper Al-Raya Al-Am was among those who expressed deep suspicion and pessimism. The paper says, quote, "Friday's UN resolution is a declaration of war on Iraq. It only lacks the 0 hour. As President Bush Sr. tried to soften the atmosphere when he launched Kuwait's liberation war, promising the Arab people to work for a solution to the Arab-Israeli problem and offering concessions to the Arabs." It added, but Bush Jr., however, does not care about the Arabs and has not made any promises to them. He quickly lent his support to the Zionist entity, praised its leaders, and supplied them with all their needs. It goes to show that the U.S. could not care less about Arab reaction or absorbing the Arab people's anger. End of quote. The Lebanese Daily Al-Nahar wrote, "It is feared that the new Security Council resolution will only be a prelude to freeing America's hand in Iraq after securing the unanimity of the Security Council." Other papers repeated Tariq Aziz, which is the Iraqi deputy minister, that when he said, "Doomed if you do, doomed if you don't." Still, there might be some people who are not waiting for a self-fulfilling prophecy. Thank you.
Unlike Dr. Montgomery, I do have a story to tell about Adam. Henry Kissinger once said that when Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden never to return, Adam turned to Eve as they were leaving paradise and remarked, "My dear, we are living in an age of transition." He is in an age of transition. It is crucial to the world economy, as Dr. Montgomery so eloquently pointed out, the geopolitical concerns there, especially regarding. It is the home to the world's most our own Osama bin, and it's also home to this man, who is the world's most obsessed man with nuclear weapons, someone who really wants them, someone who's trying to get them, and someone who President Bush wants out of power. So, what do we do about it? Now, the quotes on my slide indicate also another changing relationship in the Middle East, and that is that between the U.S. and one of its strongest and most important allies. Again, Dr. Gollub also pointed out that point in some of the things he said about this increasing tensions with the Saudis. Let's see how this thing works here. Is it the trigger? Okay, it may have gotten pushed back. Let me just pull it up a little bit. Okay, there we go. Let's see. Okay. I think you moved it instead of me, so you may have to. I'm not sure this thing was working. Now, I've picked out these two quotes to provide substance for the two main points of my presentation today. The first mentions the importance of Islam as a growing political concern. Another major element of change in the region is the change that is occurring in the religion itself. And the second focuses on my assigned topic for today, the Arab perceptions of the United States and their fears and their concerns regarding this war, impending war against Iraq. Let me just start out with my disclaimer, something we always have to do when you're here representing the Air Force. My views are my own. They are not those of the military or the U.S. government. But I do want to use these two quotes today as kind of my two major points of focus, the two areas I'm going to address. And I'm going to start with the latter one first. Next slide, please. Hey, it worked that time. All right, you might not need to sit there. Now, I'd like to bring each of these 5 points to explain the Arab bitterness from an Arab point of view. So I'll just let you read over those, and then I'm going to go through them one at a time. Now, prior to 1991, Baghdad was a very advanced Arab capital city. It had been a center of Arab learning for centuries. Its citizens were among the best educated in the Arab world. You could consider it a model Arab city. In the Middle East would like to emulate. But much has changed since the Gulf War. There's been a lot of suffering of the Iraqi people, and that suffering has been blamed on the United States because of its support of over 10 years of economic sanctions. And so Saddam is not blamed, even though in our media and in our understanding it is Saddam that is causing these problems. And, I mean, we have evidence of that, in particular when we go into northern Iraq and see how successful the Kurds are surviving under sanctions. Because up there, Saddam doesn't have the iron hand. There is some help coming in from the West. And they are doing quite well. They've rebuilt the schools. They've rebuilt their libraries. Their society is coming back to life. And yet it's happening under sanctions. So we understand that Saddam is the one who is stopping the oil for food program from working like it should. And he's blaming the sanctions on the plight of his people. But in the Arab world, they don't understand that difference. In the Arab world, they only see that suffering and that plight. And that is the concern among them. Statistics say as many as 500,000 Iraqi children could have died in the last 10 years because of malnutrition. We believe as many as 200,000 Iraqi soldiers may have been killed during the 1991 Gulf War. And so there's a lot of problems in this part of the world. And interestingly, the United States did support Iraq and Saddam in particular during its 8-year-long struggle with Iran. We were on Saddam's side. He hasn't really changed from those days. He was a brutal dictator back then as well. We liked him back then because he was our check, our balance against the Iranian problem. Iran was looked at as the bigger problem because of what had happened with the Khomeini revolution, the capture of the U.S. embassy. And so he was a bad guy, but he was
the pressure has been renewed after Saddam once again. It's hard for the Arabs to understand why.
Arab-Israeli conflict, another major concern in the region and a second concern for bitterness. The plight of the Palestinians is particularly a problem. 60% of Arabs in the region through polling data say that this is the single most area of concern. It's something that unites the Arab people against not only Israel, but the United States as the supporter of Israel. In my travels in the Middle East, I have often heard Israel referred to as the 51st state. Very common. Not only is it the 51st state, but it's probably the state with the most domestic political power. When we rank domestic political action committees in this country for how successful they are at getting legislation passed, IPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, ranks number 2, the second most powerful PAC in this country. Number 1 is a baby boomer thing, American Association of Retired Persons, but number 2 is this Israeli lobby. They are extremely powerful. And that makes the separation between the United States and Israel in the minds of Arabs very difficult to make. They see us as one and the same. They believe that the creation of the State of Israel actually doomed the Palestinians to destitution. This is often mentioned in the Arab press. And if you look at the statistics during the Al-Aqsa Intifada, you can see that. The ratio of death is about 3 to 1. Yes, a lot of Israelis have died, but 3 times as many Palestinians have died. The Saudi foreign minister has recently said the U.S. lack of effort in controlling Israel, in reining them in, makes a sane man go mad. This is a very, very concerned issue. And as a consequence, the support of the Palestinians for radical groups has increased. You see the numbers on the slide. About 15% of the Palestinians supported Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Al-Aqsa Brigades, these terrorist type of organizations, back in 2000. Now the numbers are up to about 26%, a quarter of the population. That will continue to increase if these dire conditions there continue to exist. And so the Arabs don't understand why is it that the United States, the most powerful country in the world, cannot rein in this client state and make it stop using weapons supplied by the United States against the Palestinian people. It's very difficult for them to understand. What about balance? We are there in Iraq today reinforcing, beginning anew enforcing Security Council resolutions that were passed back in the late 1990, early 1991 timeframe. All those resolutions that put Iraq under sanctions which eroded over time, are now being renewed. We're bringing them back to life and saying, okay, Saddam, you've got to give up your weapons. You've got to prove to us you don't have them anymore. At the same time, there's a couple of sanctions that have been standing against Israel for a long time. 242 and 338 call for Israel to go back to its 1967 borders and allow the establishment of a Palestinian state. The U.S. is not there pushing Israel and giving the same kind of balance to the issue as they do push Iraq. So the Arabs see this as a real lack of balance, as a favoritism to one side over the other. Again, weapons of mass destruction. Saddam has to get rid of his. Israel gets to keep theirs. More recent attempts to pass resolutions that would put peacekeepers to separate Israelis from Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza have been vetoed by the United States. If you're an Arab, you see that, and that is dead proof that the United States overwhelmingly supports Israel and has no concern whatsoever for the Arabs. Other views from the region also indicate a lack of support. If an Iraqi government, again, these are sayings, quotes from people in the region. If an Iraqi government is put in place by an outside force, it'll have no legitimacy. Change must come from within. We were able to put MacArthur in charge of Japan at the end of World War II. He wrote a constitution that stands today as the Japanese constitution. If we do that in Iraq, it won't go over quite as well as it did in Japan. The other thing that's very interesting is early attempts a year ago that were common in the press, in our press, in the Western press, to tie Saddam and Al-Qaeda together. When we initiated our war on terrorism last year, we made early efforts. I saw press articles as early as October and November timeframe pushing to say that Saddam gave supplies, funding, effort, training to Al-Qaeda in some way. There was this rumored meeting between Mohammed Atef and an Iraqi agent in Prague, which really has not come out substantiated yet. And if you look at the Ba'ath Party and what it stood for in Iraq all these many years, they've been very much against religious opposition, religion in general. The Ba'ath are a socialist party, and they've suppressed many religious leaders historically in Iraq. And so to suddenly turn around and be behind an Islamic terrorist operation would be very atypical of something the Iraqi regime would do. And so as one Saudi officer told me, the idea is actually laughable that Saddam and Al-Qaeda would get together. Most importantly, Saudis in particular tell us you're already fighting a war on terrorism. You are already needing to do something about the Palestinian issue. And now you want to go after Iraq. That's too much turmoil, too much instability, too many problems for one little part of the world. And so they are very, very concerned about us wanting to intervene in Iraq at this time. Interestingly, the same Saudi officer told me, and this is a member of the royal family, by the way, he said, you know, you defeated him in 91. Why didn't you go to Baghdad then and take him out? That so amazed me, because my understanding is we didn't go because of the Arab coalition. We didn't take him out at that time because we wanted to keep that coalition together. But Arabs have this way of understanding force and appreciating force. And if you win, you should win all the way. And so I think in retrospect, they all wish we would have gone to Baghdad back then, because they don't like Saddam any more than we do. But with all the other problems going on, they think now is a very bad time to go after him. Let me just add the particular effects on a neighboring country, Jordan, a country that has become a closer and closer ally of the United States. Again, these views are coming from a Jordanian officer. He highlighted these 4 points. Jordan has no oil, so it has a strong need for economic ties with Iraq. I've been out into the deserts of Jordan along the main highway that comes between Baghdad and Amman. There's a steady stream of oil trucks heading towards Amman coming out of Baghdad. Whether they're all part of Oil for Food, I don't know, but it's the biggest, longest truck convoy I have ever seen in my life, nonstop. When you turn around and go the other way, you just join it when you're driving back to Amman. The Gulf War brought many refugees into Iraq. They anticipate that happening again, so that's a major problem for them. Iraq threatens to do something to Israel should war break out again. And maybe they do have those weapons of mass destruction they can use. If that happens, then there's a chance you will have refugees coming from the other direction as well. Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza may also be joining the Jordanians. And Jordan, by the way, is already 50% officially Palestinian, probably 60 or 70% in reality. And so the country is very unstable and very concerned about anything happening to Saddam, because the Palestinian people traditionally have overwhelmingly supported Iraq and would do so again if a war should break out. And so that would tend to destabilize Jordan, which is a very important country to us in the region. As a final bitterness issue, I want to mention the President's own war words. When you use words like crusade against terror and axis of evil, these things don't go over very well in an Islamic country. The Crusaders, of course, were there in the 11th and 12th century. They don't want to see them coming back again. And because those words were used, emotions are on the rise in the region, and they really feel like it is indeed a crusade. And they don't like the idea of a war being conducted against Islam. It reminds us of Samuel Huntington's famous article on the clash of civilizations. They see this clash as occurring, as happening, because we are the one initiating it. It's not their doing. At least this is their perception. The axis of evil, by the way, 2/3 of the countries in the axis are Muslim countries. And when the President made that speech, every single terrorist group he mentioned were Islamic terror groups. All the focus was on Islam. So it looked like a declaration of war against Islam to many people on the Arab street. So this overall intent to attack Iraq worries the Arabs. Again, going back to what I said earlier, there's already a terror war. There's already a need to go do something about Israel. And so, bottom line, U.S.-Arab relations have significantly deteriorated in recent history, to the point that there's actually a boycott that has been initiated in the region. It's not an official boycott, but many Arabs have stopped buying American products, and trade with the Arab world is now down 25% in the first half of this year as a result of that boycott. So in summary of my first main point then, I've talked about the plight of the Iraqi people, the Arab-Israeli conflict, the views against a new war, the war's effects on border states, Jordan in particular, and these presidents' war words and how they all show that there really is a deterioration in our relations with the Arab world, and the perception has changed dramatically in recent times, especially since the war on terrorism was initiated last year. Let me move on now to my second main point, and that is to discuss Islam itself and how it is divided among itself, which makes it very hard for it to have any kind of coherence. And also to make the point that in our view, this is not a war against Islam. This is a war against radicals who are acting out of context with their own religion. They're not following the precepts, but there are a lot of people in the Islamic world that are still wonderful people and still live their religion and have their values. And in fact, I remember they had a conference here one time called Mormons and Muslims, and they put a book out about that. And there is a lot of parallels between our religion and theirs. Both are very value-laden, very family-oriented. And so When I talk about this clash, I'm talking about it as a fear, a perception that they have. And when we talk about radicals, it's a very small percentage in the region that are actually radicalized. So I'm going to go over these three main points then. Islamists hate their own governments. They'll split themselves into two major groups. And I don't know if I have time or if I should take time. There's an interesting point perhaps to make in my last bullet there. We'll look at how time is going when we get there. First point then, in this Islam as a dominant form of opposition. The Arabs really do hate their own governments, perhaps more so than they hate us. I've been talking about why they hate us, but if you look at polls from the region again, 90% are unhappy with their governments, 68% are calling for reform, and 23% actually desire to overthrow their own governments. So there's a lot of frustration there. Incidentally, the primary, most important governments of concern are those that were the same countries most involved in 9/11, and that is Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Those two governments are the closest to the United States. Those peoples in those countries view their governments as perhaps the most corrupt in the region, and they see the ability of their governments to stay in power being directly tied to the United States. If we were to cut our ties to those governments, then the Islamists would be able to overthrow them and put a more religious organization in its place. Islam itself is divided. There are the radicals. These are the ones pushing today to overthrow their governments the most. Bin Laden is their star at the moment. They get much more publicity than the revivalists. They make the news, they make the headlines every day. But interestingly, there also are revivalists out there who are a much greater numbers, much larger group, but they're the silent majority, if you will, the ones who don't have the ability to act and change things. And in fact, governments often treat them the same as the radicals and throw them in jail along with the radicals. And since they are quieter and less confrontational, they get less notice and they have less political power as a result. Still, there's some hope out there. There has been elections in several countries in the region. I will just mention Turkey of recent note. 360 out of 550 parliamentary seats captured by the Islamist Party. In Bahrain, about half of 40 seats in a brand new parliament captured by Islamists. And this is in a where the majority of the population is Shia and where the Shia boycotted the election. So you would have had probably an entire parliament of Islamists if the Shia had showed up to the election. I would say these are positive gains. And even though a lot of people in this country would worry about Islamists getting elected in the Middle East, I would argue that those getting elected are from the revivalist camp and not from the radical camp. The radicals don't want to work through the government system. They work against it. They're out to overthrow it. The revivalists work from within. They seek reform. They seek what I might call a democratization within the terms of Islam. You won't see a democracy in the Middle East like you do here, but you could see democracies moving in that direction and becoming more democratic-like as monarchies share power with their people. Jordan, a great example, again, early 90s, King Hussein held elections. Muslim Brotherhood won the most seats there, or the biggest share of seats, not a majority, but the big. His closest advisors told him, hey, you need to cancel the results here. He was brave. He let them stand. And in elections 4 years later, the Brotherhood lost seats because once they were empowered to make decisions, the people realized they didn't like the decisions they made. How am I doing on time? Okay. I can skip this one if we need to. This is really a whole nother subject and could take a whole day. I'll just let you look at this slide and I won't take time to discuss it. let me just mention that these are the views of James Q. Wilson, a pretty renowned American studies scholar. He writes textbooks on American government. He sees a big difference between West and Islam based on this focus on the rights of the individual versus rights of the group. And understanding that helps us to understand them and see that they think and act much differently than we do, which makes it hard to understand where they're coming from. But so it is something we need to understand. So I'll leave you to read his writings to see more about that. So in conclusion then, let me just review, show you my summary here again of these Islamic problems which affect our relationship with the Middle East in many more ways than I've had time to introduce in this short discussion today. But the bottom line is the U.S. should favor reform. It should encourage the revivalists and offer carrot and stick type incentives to help them gain against the corrupt Arab governments, but to do so in a way that we don't contribute to major turmoil in the region. Not an easy thing to do, but I think we need to work harder and try to understand their views better. And I'll close with that thought. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the panelists for their comments. Now I'd like to open the floor for questions of a great deal of things to think about and to respond to. Just raise your hand and we'll bring a portable mic to you so that we can respond for those who are watching via the webcast.
Question about Iran. I'm wondering how, in the last few years, it seems like Iran has been more supportive of Iraq in terms of allowing oil to be smuggled out through Iranian coastal waters. I wondered how that plays into, it seemed to me like maybe Iran was willing to back Iraq a little bit more in the last few years. Is that mainly in opposition to the U.S. and our embargo, Islamic solidarity, or there's still the cleavages there, but I'm wondering, how Iran, on one hand, they're fearful of Saddam, yet they're supportive of him too. I appreciate your comments on that.
It's a very, very good question, and I really don't have an answer. One problem with Iranian system is there are two major factions and several minor ones, and they fight against each other. Sometimes, for example, hardliners are worried that if the reformists sit down and negotiate with the U.S., that might increase the power of the reformists. So hardliners are torpedoing that simply because they're afraid of increasing the power of reformists. On oil smuggling that have been going on, it's quite well documented. I don't have a good explanation why Iran does that. I do know that the son of Saddam Hussein Uday and the son of the former president Rafsanjani, who is one of the most brutal members of the fundamentalist elite, they had illegal trade between the two countries against the UN sanctions on Iraq, for example. They just made quite a bit of money for themselves. And we all know also a lot of illegal trade goes through Jordan. I don't have a good answer why Iranian system elites do that, because Saddam makes quite a bit of money from those illegal trades, and then Saddam does use that money to help the PMOI, which then crosses border and has mortar attacks on fundamentalist regime. So it appears not to be in the interest of the fundamentalists. And the fundamentalists in Iran do a lot of things that are not rational or in their own self-interest a lot of times. So I cannot give you a good answer why they do it, but we know that happens. Again, Iran and Saddam, the fundamentalist regime in Iran and the Saddam's regime, both sponsor groups that are trying to overthrow violently each other. Iranian fundamentalists help Askari, the Supreme Council of Islamic Revolution in Iraq. Their leaders are in Iran, and ironically, one of their leaders a few years ago was appointed to be the head of the judiciary in Iran. So fundamentalists in Iran, particularly hardliners, have good close relations with Shiite Iraq opposition to Saddam Hussein. So there are limits to how close they can get. Saddam thinks that sooner than Saddam being overthrown, fundamentals are going to be overthrown. Fundamentalists believe that Saddam is going to be overthrown before. So both systems are very uncomfortable and nervous and not confident about their ability to rule in the long term. But each believes that if the other one falls before, that's going to be help to it. But again, it's a good question. I don't have a good answer and can just kind of bring you some context, but it doesn't make sense.
Any other questions? I failed to offer the board or the panel opportunity to respond to each other's comments. Anyone on the panel like to make a subsequent comment? Question?
A question about about some of the oil that's been found in Central Asia and the republics, and if pipelines are constructed which would allow countries like Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan to sell our oil and natural gas and actually get paid for it as opposed to most of it going to Russia, say. What do you think will be the effect on the regimes in those countries? Do you think that it will allow leaders like President Niaz up in Turkmenistan to consolidate their power, or do you think it will lead to an opening up of those societies?
We directed to, I guess having spent a little time in Central Asia, I do not believe that oil wealth flowing into Turkmenistan or Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan will necessarily provide for a liberalization of society. I believe it will provide for a increase of wealth in the society. I don't believe it will be equitably distributed. These are areas where regimes are very connected to family ties. The clan system, the tribal system is a background to the political system. And even in the Soviet regime, kinship and friendships were very important insofar as distribution and power, the distribution of wealth and power were concerned. I don't see an immediate liberalization. They do not have that type of tradition. I can see a material modernization of the society.
I see in the press a good deal about the Middle East, the Russians, the French, the Americans, quite a bit about Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Pakistan. I don't see anything much about China. China is looming increasingly large in a number of ways. What are the Middle East, some of those countries saying, thinking, what's their perception regarding China?
Should let Dr. Gollub answer that one. I'll just say one thing about as far as Pakistan goes. There's been a close tie between Pakistan and China. In fact, there's some belief that that's how Pakistan got its nuclear weapons was through China. So there's a tie there. But outside of that region, I really couldn't tell you much more. China obviously has a big interest in oil and a big interest in gaining a toehold in the region. But exactly, where it's moving in, who has connections, I really don't know.
Insofar as Pakistan is concerned, China has long had a relationship with Pakistan of a military technology basis, in that China has viewed Pakistan as a balance against India. India and China have disputed borders along the Tibetan border, have disputed borders along the Tibetan frontier, and have had some border skirmishes several decades ago. The Pakistan military is equipped with a mixture of American and Chinese materials. Insofar as China's role in a Near East which would have greater oil wealth, you must remember that China is a great provider of consumer goods to the world. The United States would not have Christmas if China did not make our toys. We must look at that. All our action figures largely are made in China. If there has been a turn, as your chart showed, a decline in trade with the West, certainly Near Eastern countries and Central Asian countries managing their own oil wealth more have in China an alternative for consumer goods and technology goods. And China is a competitor, will be a competitor for the Central Asian, the Near Eastern market. I don't believe China has a plan to extend its rule to the borders of the Caspian as it did during the Tang Dynasty, but it certainly would be a way to absorb wealth. When we look at the Soviet Union's problem is that the Soviet Union modernized its economy on capital goods, locomotives, hydroelectric plants, which are difficult to export. But China modernized its economy on the basis of consumer goods, which are very easy to support. And now Russia has relatively little to export, but China has a lot to export. And China will be a factor in competing for the Near East dollar by whatever regimes, autocratic, democratic, but as long as the oil wealth flows, China is interested in gaining access to that money, just as the U.S. is. And since the U.S., we get a significant part of our consumer goods from China, I think we can have a very interesting 21st century.
Major Talbot, I believe, is not allowed to buy Furbies, right? On a more serious note, Chinese have a problem with Uyghurs and other Muslim people within China, with the Han Chinese, very much like, although not as intense as the Russian problem with the Chechens and the Indian problem with the Kashmiris. So these are some of the problems that prevent China becoming too close to some of the other Islamic countries, particularly the Sunnis.
One final question.
This has been a very interesting panel, and I've enjoyed it. Two questions actually come to my mind as I listen to you. One is that unlike the Gulf War, we're unlikely to have, as you mentioned, a solid consortium against Iraq if we go to war with Iraq, and the end game going up to war could be very complicated betwixt now and then. And so I'm wondering if you various members of the panel have thoughts about who might in fact combine against a U.S.-led force against Iraq. What allies might Iraq pick up? You hinted, but do you have any definite thoughts on that? A second question that you might address is whether you think that there is a fundamental inconsistency between an Islamic state and a democratic state, is there any reason for compatibility? Given the past experience in Iran, one would wonder that. Thank you.
I teach courses on that. The first one, whether or not any country could balance against the U.S. in American invasion of Iraq. If we lived in a multilateral international system, then that would have been a possibility. But if we believe that we live in a unilateral international system, that means American power is so hegemonic, the preponderance of power is so great that no other country would be wise for it, would be in their national interest to balance the U.S., that is, go side with Iraq in actual conflict in order to prevent American defeat of Iraqi armed forces. What that means in international lingo is the great powers, such as, say, Germany and others, might verbally criticize, but they're not going to actually do anything about it. United States, of course, would be wiser if it had more allies, whether it's the UK or other countries, and particularly those countries in the region that would be able to provide military bases. At a minimum, Kuwait, Qatar, possibly Turkey would be necessary for American troops to be stationed in those bases. So the short answer is because American power is so much greater, there is no realistic possibility to prevent American military victory, then other countries might verbally oppose it. And it would be advantageous to many countries to verbally oppose it. Therefore, the Al-Qaeda or other radical Islamic groups would not target them. That's the short answer. On the compatibility between Islam and democracy, it is my view that in order to have democracy, we need to have separation between religion and the state. Obviously, religious parties could participate, but there shouldn't be a theocracy. Theocracy by its nature is problematic. Is it possible for Islamic countries to democratize? Yes. As Major Talbot showed, there have been elections, and these are good baby steps. Iran did have a constitutional revolution in 1905, had a pretty good constitution. After that, there were problems. These countries are moving toward democracy, I would say maybe 10, 15, 20 years from now. Iran is quite different from other Arab countries. Iran in 1979 did have fundamentalists come to power. I'm working on an article called De-Islamization as the Telos of Islamic Fundamentalist Rule. Anytime fundamentalists come to power, there is a great elan that everybody thinks Islamic law Sharia is going to be a panacea, is going to solve all societal ill immediately within a year. There would be no crime, no prostitution, no drug use, no divorce, no economic problems, and there's going to be prosperity, harmony, and as was quite clear in Iran, in the most extreme case, Afghanistan less so, and Sudan, which Dr. Gollub could talk more, fundamentalists basically failed. And what has happened is once fundamentalists come to power, they fail economically, politically, even morally and ethically. There is repression, there is economic problem. Then people turn against it. In Iran, we see a huge move toward democratization, secularization. The problem is fundamentalists are in power. They have the support of perhaps 5 to 10% of the population, and they're able to sell about $26, $27 billion every year. And they have committed so much crimes against the Iranian people that they're afraid to let power go. They're afraid that the Iranian people would carry out revenge and kill them. And unlike the monarchists, the Iraq fundamentalists could not easily go to exile to Beverly Hills and in Los Angeles. So they're really stuck. And therefore, they're staying there and fighting. And in Iran, there is a huge, huge crisis of legitimacy. Fundamentalists themselves have realized that the project has failed, and it has failed so utterly. It's not like China that the communists have been able to provide great material benefit. It is not even a Soviet Union where the communists did provide, made the country become the second most powerful country in the world. In Iran, fundamentalist project has failed, and it has failed totally. So there is a great deal of problem, legitimacy crisis, and that is why we see fundamentalists themselves have changed quite a bit. several of the very, very top fundamentalists have changed and have left politics, from Grand Ayatollah Montgomery, who was groomed to be successor to Ayatollah Khomeini. 2 months before Khomeini's death, he simply criticized, and he has been under house arrest. The President Khatami, he himself is not talking about fundamentalist ideas. He's really talking about civil society, democracy. He talks more like me than the Khomeini and fundamentalists. One of the bodyguards of Khomeini, a very brave journalist, Akbar Ganji, has been in jail. He just published a short pamphlet, advocates secularism. Another top fundamentalist leader, Agha Jari, who has a PhD in history. He's the chair of the history department. Several months ago, he delivered a speech, and he basically criticized the Shia doctrine, and he has been condemned to apostasy, which is quite inaccurate. He did not insult Islam or the Prophet Muhammad. What he advocated was a criticism of Shia clerics, but they are oppressing their own fellow fundamentalists because some of them have changed. So all these indications show the complete bankruptcy of the fundamentalist project in Iran. But it takes years for the fundamentalists to come in and implement policies that would clearly show to the people that does not make sense. Fundamentalists came to power in Iran and said interest on the money is against Islamic law, which it is. In the Quran, 3 verses explicitly forbid it. But you cannot have a modern capitalist economy and not charge interest for the banking system. So they have to backpedal. There is great deal of repression, economic problems, moral problems. Therefore, they are stuck. Unlike the other cases that the regimes was strong enough, allowed more moderate, revivalist, your term, for Islamists to come to power. And the Iranian case is much more problem, and in a way, I'm very, very optimistic about the prospects for democracy in Iran, unlike other Arab countries. Everywhere else, the secular governments have been oppressive. Therefore, their people are where Iranians were 25, 30 years ago. They are at they think Islam is going to provide all the solutions. In Iran, all the solutions have been attempted, and they all have failed. So Iran is quite ripe for a democratic process and democratization.
Final comment?
Okay, just briefly. Again, going back to your first question, war complications, who's going to be against? The Palestinians I mentioned will definitely be against, and I don't think that will change. I think Jordan will again end up having to sit on the fence because of their very close ties to the Palestinians, although they'll be a little more supportive of us this time. I think the Syrians will probably stay against, maybe in a fence-sitting situation there as well. Difficult to tell. The new ruler there, the son of Assad, is a little difficult to follow. The Arab states, or the Gulf states anyway, I think, despite all their rhetoric, all their opposition, which I spent a lot of time describing earlier, I think when push comes to shove, they will come down on the side of the United States and allow us to use the basing because the UN resolution is there. That was one of the rhetorical things they used initially. They said, hey, you can't do it unless the UN says you can. Well, now the 1441 says you can, although there is that caveat that they got to go back and meet again for the French wishes. So if they meet again and if the U.S. does the arm twisting and has the resolution, then I think even the Saudis will allow us to fly out of their bases. They won't be happy about it, but they'll hope it's over really fast. But I think they will end up supporting us. On the other question, I just wanted to make a further comment between my difference on the radicals and the revivalists. The radicals are caught up in a 12th century interpretation of the Quran, and they don't accept a modern interpretation. And so democracy and radical Islam is totally incompatible. But I think the revivalists realize that Islam needs to modernize and interpret. They can't be caught up in the 12th century. They have to think of modern solutions to their beliefs. And in doing so, they will find legitimacy for democratization within the Quran. And so if the revivalists are empowered, the compatibility is there. But they may have to go through that transition period like Masoud was referring to, Iran has had that transition period and the Arabs haven't, so they may have to try something radical first, which would be very unfortunate.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions and for your participation. I'd like to thank each of the panelists for their very insightful perspectives today. We're going to take a break. There actually is another lecture coming in here at lunch, but we will reconvene at 2 o'clock, where we'll be fortunate to hear from John Hughes, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, former editor of the Christian Science Monitor, and current editor of the Deseret News, who will be talking about the media role in covering conflict. So we'll meet back at 2 o'clock. Thank you very much.